Hello and welcome to KnowledgeBank.pro. We have a great video for you today titled Tips and Tricks for Building a Professional Power BI Model. Unfortunately, this will not be a very short video. I will have to cover some theory, and then we have a lab that we'll have to go through together, and I'm still debating whether I should post it as one video or break it in two. In either case, I will post all of the class materials in my blog, and the link to the materials will be provided in the description of this video. So let's talk about what will be covered in this video. First, I will talk about some of the basic concepts that we need to think about as we get ready to load our data into our model. We will talk about what is a dimension, what is a fact table, what is a star schema. If you're an expert in all those concepts, then you probably don't need to watch this video. If those concepts are not crystal clear to you, or if you feel like you could use a refresher, then stick around and I will cover those in some depth. So in this video, what I will do is we will be working with a sample file, which will be provided in the for you to download. This file, you're looking at it on your screen right now. It's an Excel file or CSV file, and I will cover all of those topics using this file as an example. As part of this video and as part of this downloadable lab, you will get this file. You will also get a step-by-step guide. Let me show you what that looks like. So you will get a step-by-step guide that you can read to refresh your memory, and then we have a step-by-step directions on what do you need to do. I will cover all of that in this video as well. So what you should do is listen to the theory, listen to me going, or watch me go through the direction myself, and that should give you enough background and theory so you could go ahead and try to follow along later, download all the materials and see if you could achieve the same results as I did at the end of this video. And the last thing you're going to get is a Power BI desktop file that I got having followed all of the steps in the manual. So in our case, you will start from a brand new Power BI file. But if you get stuck or if you want to compare the results, you'll be able to open the file we provide and see what the final result should look like and compare it to what you have. Okay, let's jump into theory. The biggest mistake that you could make when you are starting on your Power BI model is not to give any consideration to the data you're trying to load. Let's look at this example here. Somebody provided a sales file for me, and you could look at the column names, and the data in this file are pretty self-explanatory. We have product information, category, segment, manufacturer. We have some sort of geography, zip code, city, state, region. We have date, and then we have sales amount. So on one hand, this is a really handy file. I have literally everything I need to do my analysis. I have my products, I have my dates, I have my geographies. So on one hand, it seems like this is perfect. This is exactly what we need. It literally has everything that we need in one file. Unfortunately, generally speaking, a file like this is less than perfect for Power BI. So instead of loading the file as is, maybe let's take a look at this and see if we can break this into several files, and if there would be any advantages to doing that rather than loading it as is. So by just looking at the file, as I said, we have 3 different flavors of data in this, and the 4th one that's very unique. So let's talk about what we have. So we have, number 1, we have these columns here, and I will column them, let's say, in this yellow color. Hopefully you guys will be able to see it. All of this information, all of these columns here have something to do with product. Then we have these columns here. They have something to do with geography. Then this column here has something to do with date. And lastly, we have another column that basically just has a number in it. So when we look at this and this data set, we could see that there's two flavors of data available for us. This flavor of data that I have highlighted that has to do with the product, we call it a dimension. Sometimes you will think of it as a lookup table, and a good example of a lookup table would be customer, product, geography, date, chart of accounts, vendor, and things like that. And when you look at that data, usually what happens is in all of those, we call them dimensions, we will have a column that uniquely identifies a record. And usually the other thing that we need to worry about is what is the grain of the dimension. So for example, when we look at the geography, the grain, or the lowest possible level to which you could drill down in geography, in our case, is zip code. The lowest level that you could drill down in the product, in our case, would be product ID. When you look at dates, usually the lowest date would be date. So if I had a table with year, quarter, month, and date, date would be the lowest level. And that column that is the lowest level in a dimension in our lookup table, we will call it an ID column. That's very different when you're looking at an amount column, and we're going to call it a measure, right? So something that we're going to be rolling up, summing, trending, that we're going to call a measure. And anything that's not a measure, anything that we're not going to be aggregating, summing up, rolling things up, we're going to call it an attribute. So in our case, all of these columns, we're going to call them attributes. And we only have one column that's a measure, that's the amount column. So what's interesting about dimension tables, you will almost never see measures in dimension tables. So when you look at the product table, customer table, you will not, or you're not supposed to, have things like sales, revenue, discounts, and other things like that. Usually those measures will live in a special table. And that table that houses our measures, we're going to call it a fact table. So we have two diametrically different types of tables in Power BI, or in anywhere where we deal with analytics and business intelligence. We will have dimension table, and dimension table serves as the lookup, has ID and a grain, and we have a fact table. And what fact table does, it houses transaction. So usually each record in the fact table will have any kind of significance with respect to time. So a sale would have to occur on this date for this customer, for this product in this geography. The way we can turn this wide table that we have here into a fact table is by removing everything from it that's not important to store our transaction information. What do I mean by not important? If I have product ID, and that's my lowest grain of what I'm selling, so the only thing I could sell is the product, then knowing what category or manufacturer it is superfluous. If I already have a table that captures all this information, then having these columns in my fact table do not add any value, because I already know what product it is, and if I need to look up who the manufacturer is, I could go to my dimension table and look it up. The same is true for our geography. As long as I know my zip code, which is the lowest level in the United States, you could drill down to other than the physical address. So as long as I have the zip code, I can look up by zip code what city it is, in what state it is, what region it is. So if I have a geography table that houses all of this information, in my fact table, all I need to do is the absolute minimum. I just need my zip code. And then the same for date. In our case, we only have date provided, but if somebody had provided a date, a year, a month, all of those columns do not add any value for me. If I have the date, I can go and look up what year and month it is. So what I want to do is I want to make my fact table as skinny as possible. And what I mean by skinny, we only want to keep the columns that we absolutely have to have in this table. So effectively, what you will end up in a fact table is a combination of key columns that link us back to our dimension and all of the measure columns that are necessary. So in our case, a fact table will have product ID, it will have a zip code, it will have date and amount. And this is all we need to build our fact table. So here I want to switch gears a little bit and show you what the end result will look like. So here we have our sales fact, the table with 4 columns, amount, date, product, and zip, and then respective dimensions, product, geography, and date. So what would happen if I didn't have product ID in this table? Well, if I didn't have product ID in this table, I would not be able to describe my activity, my transactions by product. But if I had added manufacturer to this table, it would not change anything because I can always go back to product and find what my manufacturer is. Just to make it easier for you to navigate through all of the lab/class materials, I'm going to open up our tutorial guide and you will see original sales table broken into product attributes, geography attributes, date, and measures. Now, every time you have to load your data into Power BI, the first thing what you need to do is you need to look at your files that have been provided for you And if you're lucky, they will already be provided in this format as facts and dimensions. And with the knowledge that you have right now, you should be able to easily say, this looks like a customer file, chart of accounts, what have you, that's a dimension. And then you're going to look into the facts table in other files that look like fact tables and say, okay, that looks like a fact table. There's a date in here. I see a bunch of ID fields and I see a bunch of measures. If you have a file that has a little bit of both, then you know that you have to do some work, because loading that file as is may work. So Power BI is very powerful, and unfortunately or fortunately, a lot of times through sheer brute force, you're able to take any file, load it in, and be able to do your analysis as is. However, our goal is to build a more professional looking model. So what does a model that looks like a star schema? So we call this a star schema because we have something in the middle and we have all these rays coming out of it. So that looks like a star. Usually you will have a fact table in the middle and it'll be surrounded by dimension tables, and all these rays will be coming out to connect dimension tables to our fact table. So why does a model that look like this is considered to be more professional? There's several reasons. Number one, turns out that a model like this is a lot more performant. Number two, model that looks like this will occupy less space, because usually the table that takes the most space as the model is the transaction table, and by us taking all of the columns that we do not need and moving it into dimensions makes the fact table skinny, makes it narrow, and that makes it smaller so that it occupies less space on your hard drive and in memory. Another reason to organize it like this is because it's more self-documenting. So if you're intimately familiar with the file and you load it as is, you may not have any struggle figuring out what that file means. However, when a new person looks at your model, they may not have all of the context and background that you have. And that's why having a model organized like this makes it much easier for them to understand what's going on, how things are connected, and what's happening in this model. In real life, you are not always going to be lucky to have a neat looking model like this. The only reason we have a perfect star schema here is that we only have one fact table. So we could add more grain to the sales table, which means we can add more ID columns to the table, and we can add more dimension. So here we have geography and product. I could have added another column for customer, for channel, right? So I could add more information to this model and it would still look like a star schema. I would just have more rays coming out either to a customer table or a channel table. However, this model will not always look perfectly, particularly when you need to add a bunch of other fact tables. So adding more fact tables is what makes our model sometimes more complex. But the overall approach should be the same. Even when you add more fact tables, you should always think about, okay, where are my dimensions? Where are my fact tables? How are they connected? What is the grain of a fact table? And grain means what is the lowest level in my data that I have in a fact table. So for example, if I have data the zip code, then zip code is my grain. But you could have temperature data that would be, for example, at a state level. So the table that has history of temperatures would be done at a state level, and state would be the grain for that fact table. So what makes things challenging is when you need to compare things at different grain. So if I have to compare things by zip code against the temperature that's by state, those are the types of things that make these things complicated. But that's another reason why having a star schema approach, breaking things down into facts and dimensions, in these cases, we're able to tackle those types of scenarios with relative ease. So as you add more fact tables, it's never going to be super easy, but if you don't do this, it's going to be a lot more complicated. Okay, that took a little bit longer than I expected, but I feel like I had to cover all of those concepts, and I think you're going to find them very useful for you as you tackle more and more complicated models. The next step is to actually do the lab, and I will walk you through all of the steps necessary to take the file that had all that information in it and break it into facts and dimensions, link it up, and make a professional looking Power BI model. So let's do this. And a quick reminder, you will find a file called Star Schema Lab in the zip file that I will post on my blog. So what you need to do now is start a new Power BI desktop file, open up the Word document or PDF document with the steps, and you have two options. You can follow along, pause me at the end of each step and repeat, or listen to the whole thing and then open up the instructions and see if you can do it yourself. And if you get stuck, you can always rewind the video and see how I did it, and then try to emulate on your end. Okay, the first thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna click on Get Data and then Text CSV. Our data is in a text CSV file, so we will be loading it in our model. I assume that you have basic knowledge of how that's done, so I'm gonna skip the actual load process. You're just gonna need to click on Text CSV, navigate to the folder where you saved all of the class materials. Make sure that you unzip them all. Sometimes I've done this lab many times. Sometimes people forget to unzip it and they try to load from the zip file. So make sure that your files are unzipped. Go to that folder and load the CSV file into Power BI. As soon as you find the file, you will see this screen that says this is the CSV file that we found. You can see the columns in the file. They look good. And then you will have option to load or transform data. In our case, what we want to do is transform data, as we will be doing a lot of cleanup of our data. Once you've loaded the data, the first thing that you want to do is you want to rename. Right click and say rename, and we're going to call it sales data. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to right click on this file and we're going to say disable load. There's two ways to do this. In the manual, I tell you to go click on properties and then uncheck enable load to report. Click OK. Or you can also right click on the file, and right now it's already unchecked. If it was checked, you could click here and uncheck it. What that does, it allows you to load the file in, but not actually load into Power BI after you click close and apply. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to use it as a template, because we have to make 4 files out of this one. So we're going to use it as a template, and we're going to store the link to our original file here. The other thing that you need to do is you want to make sure that all of the data types are correct. So in our case, we have a date. So if you scroll to the right, you will find a date field. So if it didn't pick it up as a date, you could click here and pick a date. And you want to make sure that our amount is a number. So we want to make sure that this is a decimal number. So now what you could do is you can right click, and in the manual, I'm telling you to click on duplicate. And when you do a duplicate, what it will do is it will literally make a copy of this file here. In this video, I will introduce you to a new feature, and it's called reference. So what reference will do is, let me create a duplicate, and I will compare the two. So when I right click and say duplicate, you will see that in here we have 3 steps: source, promote header, change type. When we did our reference, it just says source. So it had not replicated all of the steps. Basically, it starts where this file ends. So if I were to make any more changes to this query and I go back to my second query, I would see those changes here. When I did sales, and when I did my third query, you see that all of the steps are physically replicated. So in the manual, I'm asking you guys to duplicate. In this video, I will do reference, and I will explain why. So I'm going to delete this duplicate query. First thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a product dimension. So we know which columns represent the product dimension. So what we're going to do is, first thing, we're going to rename it, call it product. There's 2 ways to do it. I can right click here and say rename, or I could go in here in properties and rename it there. So in my case, I'm just going to double click or right click here and say this is going to be my product dimension. The next step that I need to do is I need to take out from product anything that's not product. The way I'm going to do this, I'm going to click on choose columns. It's in home. And now that I'm in choose columns, I can deselect columns that have nothing to do with product. So I'm only going to select product, product ID, category, segment, and manufacturer. Everything else does not have anything to do with product. Now I'm going to click OK. If you don't think about it, it looks like we're done. We have a beautiful looking product dimension, but we do have a problem. The problem is that we have a lot of duplicates, because we're starting out with a sales file, kind of all of the sales, and a product was sold many times. We would have that product on this list many times. In any dimension, it's very important, and you have to remember this. In every dimension, you have to have a column that is unique, because that column is the ID column for that dimension. That's the grain. It doesn't get any lower than that, and it should be unambiguously unique. In our case, we intuitively understand that product ID is that column, we also know that that column has a lot of duplicates in it. So how do we remove duplicates? Luckily, Power BI has a lot of features in it, or Power Query, that allows us to do all of the typical data massaging, data manipulation. So what we're going to do is we're going to right-click on Product ID and find Remove Duplicates option. So hopefully you guys can see it. And I'm going to click on Remove Duplicates. What that does, it removes all of the records. It keeps the very first record for every new ID that it finds. Everything else gets eliminated. In the manual, I ask you guys to do the same thing for geography and date. You're in luck. I'm actually going to go ahead and do it for you here so you can see how I do it. So the way you do it is I'm going to do right-click and say reference. So I'm going to reuse that table as is. So in this case, I'm going to call it geography. Now I'm going to delete and remove all of the columns that don't have anything with geography. So we're only going to keep zip, city, state, and region. Everything else that does not have anything to do with geography, click OK. And now you've already seen that trick. You're going to right-click here, remove duplicates. Now we're going to do the same for date. Reference, rename it to date, choose columns. And right now we only have one column that has date. So that's all we'll do. We're going to set date. And right-click and remove duplicates. Now we have a nice date dimension. Sometimes it makes sense to sort it. Let's say we'll sort it ascending. And now we have everything in order. I will show you a couple of things. So in the manual, at the very end, I'm asking you some trick questions. I will answer those trick questions right now, or one ways to solve those questions. So for example, right now our date dimension only has date, and it's usually very useful to have things like months and year. So the way you can add those other columns is intuitively, again, you're going to click on Add Column. Make sure that we have our date column selected. Add column. Then you can click on date. And from here you can parse out year. And now you have your year. And you can also, so don't forget, every time you add a column, it's going to be based on some other column. So make sure that that proper column is selected. So pick your date and then click on date, and you could pick month, or you can also pick name of month. And if you don't want to spell the whole thing out, now we're not going to be adding a column, we're going to be transporting the existing column. So pick the column that we have selected, click transport, and what you could do is you could click on extract first characters, and you could say first 3 characters. And here you go, you have month ID and month name. So now we are done with our dimensions. We have our product, geography, and date. Make sure that you do remove duplicates in all of those columns, in all of those tables, on the column that will serve as your ID, as unique. And now what we need to do is we need to create our fact table. The way we're going to create our fact table is we're going to duplicate our sales, or rather we're going to do a reference. We're going to name it sales fact. And now we're going to delete all of the columns that we don't need. So we're going to click on Home, choose columns, and we're going to take out anything that's not an ID column or not a measure. Product ID, zip, date, and amount. Everything else we already have in other tables, and then we can click on OK. You never need to remove duplicates on a fact table, right? Fact table we leave as is because every row here is a transaction, so something happened. So it never makes sense to remove duplicates here. But when we create our dimensions, you will need to think about whether you do or don't need to remove duplicates based on your situation. And now I want to talk a little bit about why did I use reference versus duplicate. Turns out this is a neat trick. For example, right now you guys saved your file into a folder, but let's say you want to move it from your personal computer to a network drive. So you could click on so here for the first source step, you see a gearbox. You can click on a gearbox and pick a different location for your file. So if I had done duplicate, you would have to do it 4 times for all, or 5 times for every table in our model. By me doing reference, I am reusing that connection to our data in this query in all of my subsequent queries. So I only need to do it once. So if I decide to move this file to a different location, I could just go to sales data, to source, change it to a different file. All of the derived tables that I have in my model will automatically inherit that location for the source data. And the very last thing we need to do is we need to make sure that the tables we created can be loaded into Power BI. The way we do it is we're going to right click on every table and make sure that enable load is true. So right now I see that enable load is true, or I could click on properties and make sure that this checkbox is turned on. So I'm going to check all of my tables, enable load, enable load, enable load, and I don't want to have enable load on my sales data because that's basically just a reference for how I can get my source file. So that table we will not be loading. Now that that's done, we should be all done with our table. We can click on close and apply and see what happens. Okay, now that my data is loaded, you can see the date table did not get loaded. Your mileage may vary. You may have none of this table not loaded, connected. In my case, product and geography got auto-detected for relationship and date didn't. For me to create a relationship, there's two ways for me to do this. I can just click on the date column here and drag it into the date column into sales fact and just release my mouse, and you see that builds my relationship. So now that created the relationship between date and sales fact table. Another way to do this, and I mentioned that in the manual, you could click on manage relationships, click on new, and create a relationship here. You could have clicked on date to sales fact, pick date here, relationship, and click OK. In our case, we already have one ready, so it won't let me create it again. But you get the idea. Okay, and now that you have this beautiful star schema, you're ready to build your reports. Actually, there is one more thing that I do in our model. What I do is I ask you to hide all of the ID columns in our fact table. And the reason I want you to do this is because we have zip, product ID, and date kind of twice. We have date in sales fact, and we also have date in date table. So not to confuse our users, it's always a good idea to right-click and hide things that could be confusing. So we always want our users to use attributes from the dimensions. In a professionally built model, you will never expose any attributes in your fact tables. The only thing you expose in the fact tables should be your measures. So now if I want to build a trend chart, I could drag that into our canvas and drag my amount into values, and I have some sort of trend, or I could bring my manufacturer into another chart and basically trend it this way. So again, this lab has nothing to do with reports. We have a whole report building storytelling class available on KnowledgeBank.pro. Right now, I just wanted to do a quick tutorial and a lab on how to build professional models. By now, we know about things like dimensions, facts. We talked a little bit about relationships. We know that dimensions will have certain grade. They'll have an ID, and that ID should be unique. We talked about how a fact table should only have ID columns and measures, and we want to keep our fact tables as narrow as possible. So as I said before, all of the class materials will be available on my blog. I will post there will be a blog article with a link in it, and the link will be to a zip file that will have all of the class materials. So you can download and either follow along or just try to emulate me after you have watched the video. This is a super important video. When you're beginning, the way I've in my life seen thousands of models, and the first thing that helps me understand whether this model is done by somebody who is more or less senior in Power BI or a complete amateur is having that dimensional flavor to the model. So by you breaking things into dimensions and fact tables, you're going to make your life easier. You're going to make people who will be maintaining this model after you're done with this lives easier. And it's just professional courtesy, frankly, to organize things like this, because most Power BI, seasoned Power BI people will have certain expectations to how things should be laid out. And when they see easily identifiable facts and dimensions, you're making everybody's life much easier. Another thing is, how should you name your facts and dimensions? Sometimes you will see tables that start with dim, D-I-M, or fact, and those are hints that it's either a dimension or fact table. Sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't. In my mind, usually it's pretty easy to tell those apart, but you will see a lot of code guides out there that will spell out that you should name things as facts and dimensions. If you have an ID column, it's a lot of time a good idea to spell it out and say product ID, customer ID, things like that. So it just makes it easier for people to understand, makes your model more self-documenting. And don't forget, on your fact tables, if you can, if you do your job properly, you should be able to hide all of the attributes in your fact tables and only keep your measures around. And a lot of times what I will do is I will create actual Power BI measures and hide everything in the fact table, so a user cannot even see it to begin with, and that makes it much easier for people to navigate. Okay, hope you found this video useful, informative. I will be posting a bunch more labs on our blog and on this channel, so you could practice a lot of different facets of Power BI. So I'm looking forward to see you back soon. Bye.